Everybody, good evening. Can you hear me? Good. I'm Peter Joseph. I'm the group leader of the Marin chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Who's here from Citizens Climate Lobby? Whoa! Bravo. We are a national, nonpartisan, grassroots organization, currently with 210,000 members across the U.S. There are 34,000 of us in California and 1,500 in Jared Huffman's congressional district, including 900 here in Marin. We're organized into 416 chapters, who in just the past year during the pandemic conducted almost 900 lobby meetings and published 2,700 letters to the editor and 835 op-eds and editorials. And in the past year during this reconciliation process, we logged 50,000 calls to Congress and sent 162,000 emails. Jared knows us well. So this organization's main thrust is a carbon price, and we advocate for a revenue-neutral, fully refunded carbon fee, dividend, and border carbon duty. That means the fossil fuel companies would pay when their products, oil, coal, and gas, enter the economy, and the revenues would be largely recycled to you. And along with that, a border carbon duty to level the playing field between U.S. industries and countries that don't have a carbon price. This plan has the backing of literally the entire economics profession. And the bill that had these features has 97 co-sponsors in the House, including Representative Huffman, for which we thank you very, very much. So I first got involved with the climate crisis after seeing, like many of you, an inconvenient truth. And as an emergency physician, I realized, holy cow, this is the mother of all emergencies, and I have to get involved. So I got into the training in Nashville in January 2007 with, at that point, the guy who should have been President of the United States, and started giving his talks, which is basically the sky is falling. But at the end of the talks, people would say, what can I do? And all I really had for them was the usual personal carbon footprint things that many of us have done. Get a Prius, take shorter showers, shop at the farmer's market, eat less meat, turn down your thermostat, and that sort of thing, all of which is good, but nowhere near the scale of the problem. And that felt like a kind of cruel cognitive dissonance to me. But in the summer of 2011, I got myself arrested for the first and maybe last time in front of President Obama's house at the Keystone XL pipeline civil disobedience. Arrested by SWAT team people, of all things, like I'm dangerous. That felt good. No, but seriously, I do have a picture. It's one of my prized pictures. I got the hands behind the back and the flexi cuffs on, and I'm being led by two guys who were very nice, by the way. But it felt symbolic, and it was symbolic, and it led to Obama's redlining the pipeline, yes, but it didn't feel like enough. And right after that, when I got home, I met CCL, and their plan just appealed to me. It's like, get the money right, and we might have a chance. You don't get the money right, there's no way we're going to stop this industry because of two things. Fossil fuels are cheap, and polluting the atmosphere is free. How can you withstand that? So that's when I got involved with CCL. I became leader of this chapter. I've watched CCL grow and mature and become very well organized, as all you CCL members here know. So we sponsored the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is now in its second iteration, which has 97 House co-sponsors, as I said, including Representative Huffman, for which we are very grateful. And of course, we're very excited about the bill that just passed in Congress. It is not a carbon pricing bill. We're a little disappointed in that, but this is a great, historic piece of legislation, and we're very hopeful that it's going to get us almost to our Paris commitment of 50% reductions from 2005 by 2030. But it misses by 10%. And, you know, some people say a miss is as good as a mile. I don't particularly agree with that, and we're happy about it. We're hopeful that in the coming years, as this bill takes form and has an effect in our country, that people will realize the air is cleaner, there are a lot of good jobs being created, inflation is under control, this is good medicine, and realize that the final push will require a carbon price, which is literally the recommendation of the entire economics profession in this country. And besides, the European Union may impose a border carbon adjustment, which we're going to have to respond to with our own carbon price. So finally, I just want to say a few words about courage. I have walked the halls of Congress 18 times in the last 10 years. I've been nervous, I've been excited, I've been thrilled to be in the halls of power, unimpeded, walking into the building through the metal detectors, and never afraid, never afraid. Michael Mann has spoken truth to power to people who really didn't like his message. And they've been after him since he published the hockey stick graph in 1998. They have mercilessly attacked him, hassled him, threatened him, and he has stood up to them and won. So bravo to Michael Mann. I also didn't think, walking the halls of Congress, that it took a tremendous amount of courage to be a member of Congress. It's a very hard job and it's very demanding. But I never thought it was like threatening. That all changed on January 6th. And now I wonder what it's like for you, Jared, to get into an elevator or sit in a committee meeting with people, your colleagues, who you have to work with, who clearly disrespect our Constitution, disrespect the rule of law, and countenance political violence. That to me is really scary. But Jared, you have shown an amazing spirit. You're upbeat. You're working really hard. You've been very, very productive. And that, I think, deserves all of our imaginations, appreciation. So thank you so much. And now Bill Petrocelli.
Good evening. I'm Bill Petrocelli, one of the owners of Book Passage, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here and everyone who's online watching this. You've got two different groups. Your inspiration from Al Gore, he stood right here, right where I'm standing right here, and gave a talk on that very point several years ago, and to a packed house, as you would imagine. And that was the first of a couple of speeches that he made at a Book Passage event. So we're with you. We're with you all the way on that. Let me just say, first of all, that I'm basically here to welcome you and to introduce our co-panelist, Jared Huffman, our Congressman, who will in turn introduce our main speaker. I don't want to get too many introductions here in front of you, but let me just say this. If you're here in the audience, you probably know who Jared Huffman is. He's a congressman from the 2nd District of California, which is right here. And and if you're online and you don't know who Jared Huffman is, you'd be very lucky to have a congressman this good, because he is one of the best and one of the strongest when it comes to environmental issues. He's been in Congress here since 2013. And he's an environmental expert. He was the chair of an environmental committee in the state legislature before that. And before that, he was a member of the worked with the National Resources Defense Council on environmental issues. And in his spare time, he's also litigated some civil rights actions to protect both women's rights and minority rights. So we are very, very lucky to have him as a congressman here in this district in California. And I will turn it over to Jared. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill and Book Passages. Bill, you and Lane over the years have had so many important gatherings in this place. And if anybody, tonight's going to be great. If anybody doubts that we can succeed in this war against the climate crisis, just look at Book Passages. My gosh, they said bookstores were dead a long time ago. And Bill is going strong, and we're grateful for it.
Oprah is good, that good.
So it is my great honor to introduce Professor Michael Mann. And he's a celebrity. You will see him on national television any given week. He's even more famous than some of you might know, because if you've seen the hit Netflix film Don't Look Up with Leonardo DiCaprio, that film was inspired by Dr. Mann and his work over the many years. So look, he's one of the world's foremost climate scientists. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on his credentials, but they are impeccable. UC Berkeley undergrad, Yale graduate degree. He is a distinguished professor at University of Pennsylvania, before that many years at Penn State. And he's a member of the most elite body of climate scientists in the world, the IPCC. So amazing credentials. But there's lots of smart scientists. There's even some with Yale graduate degrees. I think what really distinguishes Dr. Mann is his ability to communicate. And like the great Carl Sagan, who inspired Dr. Mann to become a climate scientist, Dr. Mann takes his gifts for science and brings them to us, makes science real, brings it to life, makes it interesting for his students and others. It also makes it useful to people like me who need to make tough policy decisions. Dr. Mann is not afraid to advocate, which some scientists are kind of squeamish about and nervous about. They think it might sully their independent scientific credentials. But Dr. Mann goes there, and he even, gasp, engages in politics. I don't think that makes him any less of a scientist. I think what it shows is that he's got a great brain and a great moral compass. And this book that we're here to discuss tonight, The New Climate War, is a fantastic example of that. He doesn't spend a lot of time explaining the climate crisis to us, because as he points out, that was sort of the old climate war. That was the first few decades where we were up against denial. Instead, he just hones right in on the new climate war, which is all about a term he coins that I just love, and I'm going to use it if it's okay with you, Dr. Mann, inactivists. And all of these tools that they use, deflection, delay, one of the most devastating is the doomsaying that they tend to draw people in, which is just another way to attain delay in inaction. He breaks it down so beautifully. And I was telling Dr. Mann before we came in here that I run into all of this stuff every day in Congress. This is absolutely the Republican playbook because it's the fossil fuel industry playbook. But the way he lays it out and explains it, going back to examples from industry groups that have used the same playbook over the last century, is incredibly helpful and insightful. And he also gives us some great suggestions for how we can all recognize it and call it out and push back against it. I think my favorite piece of that, Dr. Mann, is the way you call out fake climate solutions, which is an important part of the new climate war, right? Because the fossil fuel industry and Republicans have evolved from outright denial to all of these different artifices that they use. And there are a lot of fake solutions lurking behind terms like innovation and research, and Dr. Mann just calls it out quite beautifully. So I'll just tell you, I liked this book way more than I thought I would. I read a lot of climate books, and I thought, okay, I'm going to read another climate book. It was much better than that. It's really unique and different and super timely to where we are right now and what we've got to do to tackle this climate crisis. So I think you're going to enjoy hearing from Dr. Mann, and I really hope all of you leave here with one of his books tonight because it's super important stuff. Dr. Mann, welcome to Marin.
Thanks so much, Congressman. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Book Passages. Thanks, Peter, for your comments and your kind words. I just spent the last few days touring through the Congressman's district with some friends of mine. We started off here in the Bay Area and worked our way all the way up to the Oregon border. And that trip reinforced something that I've been talking about for some time now, which is that climate change, the climate crisis, is no longer an abstract problem. It's not about polar bears off in the Arctic. It's about real-time disasters that we now see play out in real time. The redwood forests that are now catching on fire, and you could smell wildfire smoke all the way up to the Oregon border. The rather pitiful stream flows, the river flows, which are so low right now. The kayaking that we had hoped to do wasn't possible because of that. So our lives are being impacted on a daily basis. And, that's sort of a first world problem, to not be able to kayak with your friends or to have to deal with wildfire smoke. But there are folks right now in Mississippi, Jackson. Some of you may have been hearing about this story over the past few days, several 100,000 of them without fresh drinking water. And it's a profound example of sort of the cascading impacts of climate change. They're things that we don't really think about. We don't game out. Scenarios we don't game out and don't realize that they're a problem until we see them play out. One example of that is the combination of wildfires, like we've seen over a large part of California in recent years, the destabilization of the ground soil, the loss of vegetation, sort of sets us up for these devastating mudslides when those winter rains come. And when those winter rains come, there's more rainfall because the atmosphere is warmer. When it does rain, we get more of those flooding rains. They combine with the devastating impacts of wildfires to give us deadly mudslides. In Mississippi, what we're seeing right now, this was a flooding event that led to contamination of the water supply, sewage leaking into the water supply. There are heat indices right now, triple digits in that area, and they have no drinking water. It's just a reminder now that we're seeing the devastating consequences play out in real time. So, as Congressman Huffman said, I don't spend a lot of time talking about sort of the science behind climate change these days, explaining to people that climate change is real, because I think by and large people understand that. Those who are open-minded, those who are open to viewing the evidence that's right in front of them, can see that climate change is real. It's human-caused, and it's already having devastating consequences. So there is still some residual science denial. There are still efforts to convince at least some, portion of the public that, climate change isn't real, it isn't human-caused. And I think, by and large, that is... if you look at the public polling, less than 10% of the public literally deny climate change now. There is still an intent to magnify that sort of message, denialism, to get people to think that it's more prevalent than it is. Because if you believe that your neighbors and or your classmates or the people around you deny the science of climate change, then that tends to chill the discourse. You're unlikely to broach that topic with them if you think that it is going to lead to sort of antagonism and conflict. And so if you look at the public polling, even though less than 10% of the public now deny the scientific evidence of climate change, more than 30% of the public, most people will estimate that more than 30% of the public deny climate change. So there's this huge gulf between how many people actually do deny it and how pervasive we think denial is because of the megaphone of the conservative media and Fox News. So denial is still there, and there are relatively few people that that deny the science, but there's a fairly large sort of cross-section of the population that thinks that denialism is still prevalent, and that tends to, as I said before, it sort of leads to disengagement. We're unlikely to talk about it with people that we think might be offended. And if we're not talking about the climate crisis, then we're not putting the pressure that needs to be felt by policymakers. So I'm not going to dismiss denial altogether, but as Congressman Huffman said, the fossil fuel industry has moved on. They realize that by and large they've lost that battle. The majority of people recognize this is real. They recognize the impacts that are playing out. The fossil fuel industry hasn't given up, but they're turning to other tactics, and that includes deflection, convincing us that we don't need policies, we don't need, subsidies for renewable energy, we don't need carbon pricing. We just need to be better stewards. We use, more efficient appliances and drive more efficient vehicles and change our diets and travel less. So that's deflection, convincing us that it's about individual behavioral change, putting it on us when 70% of the carbon emissions come from just 100 fossil fuel companies in the world. And so individual action alone, sure, we should do everything that we can to minimize our own environmental impact and our own carbon footprint, but that's not going to get us the reductions that we need. We need to change the system. And that's why I'm excited, as Peter and the Congressman are, about the IRA, this recent legislation. It's not going to solve the climate crisis on its own. But at the same time, it's by far the most aggressive climate legislation we've ever passed. And it doesn't get us all the way to where we need to be. We need to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by 2030, within 8 years. And in fact, you can even argue that 2005 baseline, the choice of a 2005 baseline makes the numbers look a little better than they really are. So maybe it isn't even really 40%. It's a little less than that, and we've got to get to 50%. But there is the real danger, and this is part of the new climate war. This idea that if it isn't perfect, then it's somehow useless, and if it doesn't contain everything that I would like to see, that I'm going to, campaign against it, and I'm going to criticize and dismiss it. And as a result, we've seen sort of the weaponization of people who should be our allies in, this battle, who have instead become weaponized by bad actors to, for example, to oppose this recent climate legislation. And there was one of the fossil fuel industry front groups, was actually caught out, and I forget the details of it, but there was there was an industry group that was connected to an effort to convince progressives that this climate legislation was going to hurt them, to try to create a wedge within sort of the progressive community, and that's what they try to do, to divide. That's one of the D words, the new climate war. It's about deflection. It's about division, getting us fighting with each other. If we're fighting with each other, then we're not taking the fight to the enemy. It's a divide and conquer sort of strategy that's been very effective, and I talk a fair amount about that in the book. Delay. The Congressman said, these promises of technology, carbon capture and sequestration. Sure, we're going to capture all of that carbon. Trust us, and we'll bury it where it'll stay for the long term. We've got this. Don't worry. So it's fine for us to continue to mine and burn these fossil fuels because we'll fix the problem down the road. It's a very convenient excuse for inaction today. And sure, there might be sort of technological carbon capture approaches that down the road we will want to implement. We shouldn't dismiss that out of hand, but what we should recognize is it's not viable today. It's not going to be viable at scale within the next 10 years, and we've got to cut our carbon emissions by 50% within the next 8 years, in fact. We're not going to get there through carbon capture, but it's very convenient for polluters to convince us that that is the solution. Sure, we want to solve this problem too, and we're happy to get behind these sort of false solutions that kick the can down the road to take the pressure off of doing what's necessary now, solving this problem the only truly reliable and safe way by getting off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that tactic. And, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not perfect. We all recognize that. There are things that many of us would like to have seen in there that aren't in there. And there's some things that are in there that many of us would wish that they weren't in there. There is, at least some lip service to, carbon capture, for example. And there isn't carbon pricing. Now, we need to level the playing field, as Peter said. There are at least two different ways to do that, right? You can incentivize renewable energy, provide subsidies and incentives to renewable energy, and help it outcompete fossil fuel energy that way. Or you can put a price on carbon. I would like to see both of those mechanisms. You can sort of think of it as the carrot and the stick. And the IRA, this bill had a fair amount of carrot, but I would argue we need some stick too. And so the bill didn't go as far as many of us would like us to see it go. That doesn't mean that it was bad. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have been putting our weight behind it because it is the most aggressive climate legislation that I believe that we could have passed in a 50-50 Senate where the gatekeeper to climate legislation is a coal state Democrat. If you don't like that fact, let's make it not the case that the gatekeeper to climate legislation is a coal state Democrat. And so to me, the imperfection of that legislation is a call to arms going into these midterm elections. It is why it is so important that we get out and we vote on climate, and we put in place the majorities that will be necessary to get more aggressive climate legislation. So let's take the win. And let's go for more. That is my perspective on this. I could continue to lecture at you because I'm a professor. I've spent 20 years now lecturing at people, but I wanted this to be more of a conversation, of a discussion, and I certainly want to. And I would love to, Congressman, I would just love to. I saw your district, and there is so much majesty and beauty. The redwood forests that you preside over, a lot of carbon sequestered, and a lot of carbon that's escaping into the atmosphere right now. And this is one of the things that I saw in Australia. I was on sabbatical in Australia during what is now called the Black Summer. I wrote a large part of this book. I went to Australia to work with some scientists in Sydney studying the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events, and instead I arrived for the most extreme weather event that we have seen, what's now known as the Black Summer, where we saw unprecedented heat and drought that combined for these wildfires that blanketed the continent. And in that season, in that one several month period, Australia put more carbon into the atmosphere through those forest fires than they did through all of the fossil fuel burning they had done for that entire year. And so one of the things we worry about is that some of these carbon sinks will become less viable. We're going to lose some of that stored carbon. It's all the more reason to be a bit skeptical about, now we can talk about artificial carbon capture and sequestration, but we can also talk about, oh, well, we will just engage in massive reforestation and afforestation. And sure, we should do that, but we're not able to count on that as, that is not a 100% reliable way of keeping carbon in the ground. You know what is a 100% reliable way of keeping carbon in the ground? Keeping carbon in the ground. So it's an amazing district, just because of the beauty and majesty and the role that it's playing in the carbon crisis, but also the visibility of the impacts of climate change as we see them play out.
Well, you're totally. Can we take this over here and maybe hand it around? Totally right, Dr. Mann. And in fact, the climate crisis is playing out in ways that you don't even see as you're driving up the beautiful coast. Most of the kelp forests up and down the north coast are gone, and that came out of nowhere. It hit us very abruptly because an algal bloom killed off and other diseases driven by warming water and ocean conditions, killed off starfish, which used to kill urchins, which have now proliferated and eaten all the kelp. And so we don't have abalone, we don't have kelp, and we are doing these emergency interventions to bring them back. It's a little bit like our coral bleaching equivalent here on the north coast of California. So you could study the heck out of the climate crisis right here in the 2nd District, and you'd have plenty to look at.
Well, a sobering example of that just this morning. As I said, my friends and I, we went all the way to the border with Oregon. We started out in Crescent City this morning and came back in time for this event. But we stopped off this morning along the way at a beach near Arcata and went down to the beach. There were a bunch of children who were very animated. And what we learned was that there was a dead sea lion. We saw a dead adult sea. I had never seen it was disturbing. Just a dead adult sea lion that was sitting there on the beach decaying. Now, the entire food chain is impacted. I'm not going to say that sea lion was necessarily a victim of this algal bloom, but it did impact that area, and we did see one starfish that was dead. In one of the coastal one of the tidal pools there. So this stuff is very visible. It's very real. I want to now turn it over to the audience, and maybe we can get into some discussion. Right here.
So the IRA passed, and I know I'm in CCL. We had our chapter a big celebration. I'm just wondering, what do you feel the next focus should be on?
That sounds like a loaded question. No. Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that question. What's the next? Yeah, the IRA is passed. Inflation Reduction Act is passed, and we got some real climate. There are a lot of good stuff in there for subsidizing, renewable energy. But what's if we could get something more aggressive? If we could build that, that majority in Congress for climate action. What would be the next thing to do? And I'm not pandering, because if you read my book, you know that I am a supporter of carbon pricing, and precisely what form that should take, I leave that to be debated among our policymakers. There's a good faith debate to be had about these sorts of details. I don't want to try to prescribe what form. I do think CCL has the CCL's vision of carbon pricing is a very compelling one. But let's have that conversation. But I would like to see carbon pricing. I think we need to use all of the tools in the toolbox, and subsidies and incentives for renewable energy. The carrot is really important, but I think we need some stick too. So I would like to see some sort of carbon pricing, a carbon tax, revenue neutral carbon tax. there are in the original version of the reconciliation package before it became what's now known as the IRA, there was what's known as a clean energy portfolio standard, which is another sort of way of doing the same thing, where you require, utilities to provide an increasing share of their energy from renewable sources. It's another market mechanism. There are different ways to do it. But I would like to see something along those lines, something more than just, well, we're going to try to help out the renewable energy industry and provide people incentives for efficiency, for using renewable energy. I would like to see some sort of demand side tool that involves carbon pricing in some way. And
Sure. Well, a couple thoughts on that. We're going to have to win quite a few seats in order to get at an economy-wide carbon pricing solution. Maybe we can do that, but I think more likely we'll be doing something incremental. And I think the most likely carbon pricing pieces that could be viable would be the carbon border adjustment, because the European Union is doing that in our direction. And I'm urging them to do that because that gives us a chance to turn around and do the same thing back. And, you begin to get a little bit of carbon pricing out there. Another one would be for transportation fuels, because we are moving inexorably towards electric vehicles now. And the IRA is terrific in some of the pieces that it puts in place. But the next conversation you have to have is, what about our gas tax revenues? These are goals that are not that far away. And we're talking about fundamentally changing the revenue mechanism for maintaining and building transportation infrastructure. So we're going to have to, that forces a conversation about, I think, carbon pricing on all transportation fuels. Electricity will do better, but it's an invitation to do something, a bill I proposed when I first came to Congress, which is a life cycle carbon fee on all transportation fuels. So those are two thoughts. And then the third that I think we got to get to work on right away is the supply side, because Manchin forced some things on us that are not good. There is way too much business as usual still underway. We got to keep more of these fossil fuels in the ground, and I think there's a lot of work that can and has to be done on that side of it.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something that has it's come up a lot, rightfully, among critics of the legislation, who point out that there are all these incentives for new pipelines, for new fossil fuel infrastructure, when the International Energy Agency, no cheerleader for renewable energy, has said that additional fossil fuel infrastructure at this time is incompatible now with the goal of keeping warming below 3 degrees Fahrenheit, truly devastating levels of warming. And so now some of my colleagues sort of in the energy economics field say, well, don't worry, because if we provide enough incentives for renewable energy, then those leases will go unsold. That I'm skeptical about that. Exactly. I'm skeptical about that. So thanks, yeah. Yeah, another question back here. Yeah.
First of all, go Quakers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
To two of you, but basically I've been out shopping for an electric vehicle for the last 4 months. It's not easy. And then after the IRA was passed, the incentives kind of went out the window unless it's American made completely, and there is no such thing other than baby test. That's one thing throwing at you. The other has to do with water. If you read the Marin Journal, the editorials are always about for or against some stupid pipeline going to the East Bay. They don't have any water either. So what's more reasonable? For our drought, we just finished watching 5 Days at Memorial about Katrina, which is, as a doctor, I was just appalled to think about making that decision. And of course, we've just seen so many floods every week in other parts of the country. What's our solution?
I'm going to pass this one to the Congressman.
It's a fairly local question, at least on the water. I agree. I think that pipeline. Thank you. I wouldn't come right out and call it a stupid pipeline, but I think it's a pretty stupid pipeline. And the good news is I think the Water District is beginning to work on the more promising and resilient modern water supply tools that make the most sense. I will just say that in the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed last November, signed into law last November, we put tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on the table for Western water investments, and I got to write a lot of that law. I am proud of the fact that in previous generations, we would have been funding big dams and controversial things that are not going to be truly resilient in the face of climate change and are a waste of money. This funds really modern stuff: water use efficiency, water recycling, groundwater management, the kind of tools that can actually make us more resilient. And on the EV piece, you're absolutely right. If you can get on the wait list and get an EV now, get it before the end of the year, because these content standards are about to kick in. And I don't think there's any EV on the market right now that will meet them, although I think some of the ones coming to market next year are going to be working really hard to try to meet the standards. We all want to get to these standards, but I think Manchin kind of jammed the EV industry, frankly, with these standards by making them kick in too quickly. So we could have a period of time where the tax credit is unavailable until the industry can catch up.
Now, I wonder if that can be revisited in the next Congress. Yeah.
Some seats,
Yeah. Question right here. Yeah.
I'm curious in your discussions, Michael, with NGOs, corporations, and others, including Big Green, if you have much feedback on the diversion policy, as referred to as forest carbon offsets. They're growing rapidly. They have a lot of support across corporations. And in that whole process, everybody seems to come out ahead except the farmers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of documentation from people and others that are finally coming out on what's really going on.
Yeah.
What's your take on the whole forest carbon offsets?
Can you please repeat that?
Sure. Yeah. So forest carbon offsets, we're here. They're very popular, in industry, for example, as a way to sequester carbon, as an alternative to other means of carbon abatement. And, is this viable? What do I think about it? At some level, it sort of evokes medieval indulgences. It's a right to pollute. And I'll get back to the point I made before. There's no guarantee that carbon stays sequestered, especially in these times where we're seeing more rampant wildfires. We're seeing forest carbon lost to the atmosphere through deforestation, through forest fires, through other means. And that carbon has a fairly short residence time. The residence time of trees at most is, over the last few days I saw some 1,000-year-old trees, but that's 1,000 years. The fossil fuels that we're digging up, they've been there for 100 million, 200 million years. And so that difference in residence time means we're taking the carbon that was safely buried, putting it into the atmosphere, and then trying to shallowly bury carbon in the hope that that's somehow going to offset. It's just that there's too much of a disconnect there. There's too much of an opportunity for that carbon, store to ultimately, there is the great likelihood that carbon just won't stay sequestered for the long term. And so it's not a permanent solution. The only permanent solution is to not pull the carbon out of the ground and put it into the atmosphere. Now, that having been said, I do think that there's some certain difficult to decarbonize sectors of the economy right now, cement production, aviation. And so, there are areas where it's going to be difficult for us to decarbonize those sectors in the near term. And it's worth looking at, relatively safe and reliable and verifiable, carbon sequestration as one means of offsetting those emissions. But to be using forest carbon sequestration as somehow an offset to the continued mining and burning of fossil fuels makes no sense at all. It's not a viable path forward as far as I'm concerned.
No, I agree. Financial incentives to protect old growth trees we need, absolutely. And it's the old growth where most of that carbon is sequestered. But any other way of using forest carbon sequestration, it's risky. As Dr. Mann points out, you could lose it all. And it's slow. It takes a long time to build up all of that sequestration. It doesn't meet the time scale that we're facing.
That's exactly right. I mean, those redwoods have been storing carbon for a pretty long time, and we want to keep them there. And I was saddened to see trucks, with redwood logs going past me as we drove back down this morning. Right here.
Yeah, hi, it almost seems like putting the cart before the horse with putting a carbon tax on, although I so strongly support it. When we are giving subsidies to fossil fuels, right? So, what can we do about cutting down some of those subsidies?
Let's get rid of those subsidies. Let's get rid of those subsidies. Let's subsidize renewable energy. Let's put our thumb on the right side of the scale. Subsidize renewable energy and get rid of those subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And that's one of those areas, again, where we're not seeing enough progress. Also, when it comes to the allowance of additional construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, these are areas where the IRA didn't accomplish what we need to do, and we really want to focus more on that.
Well, Dr. Mann talks about this in his book in a really compelling way. Simply allowing all of this fossil fuel activity to exist is the biggest subsidy in the history of civilization, because they are outsourcing all of their pollution into the atmosphere and destroying the planet. That's the subsidy we need to end.
Yeah, our friend Bill Kibben, put it very well some years ago. He said, we've granted the fossil fuel industry the greatest, subsidy of any industry ever. They're allowed to dump their pollution into our atmosphere at no cost. Right here. Yep.
My question is for Representative Huffman, and that's, is it possible to do a divide and conquer on the Republican Party? Find some there that might understand that this actually is a crisis.
Yeah, this was maybe my favorite part of Dr. Mann's book, because, the question is it possible to peel off some Republicans who understand there's a crisis and work with them on some kind of bipartisan solution? We all would love the answer to be yes, including me. I would just love that. It would be faster, it would be more durable, it would be better in every way. But Dr. Mann does a great job of breaking down the truth behind this sort of evolving rhetoric that you're hearing from the Republicans. They have totally crossed over into no longer overtly denying climate change. But everything that they are calling for, if you dig into it, is about more fossil fuel use. And so to me, until they are ready to face the imperative of confronting the fossil fuel industry head on, not tiptoeing around it, not carrying their water for them with all these fake solutions, I'm sorry, but I think the answer is no. And, I can count the number of exceptions in the House of Representatives on one hand. The number of Republicans who will actually work with me on something meaningful that actually confronts the fossil fuel industry. Everybody else, it's just messaging. And that's worse than nothing in some ways. And this book does a great job of explaining just how insidious that is.
Thanks. And I'm interested in your thoughts about this. There are probably at least a dozen Republicans who would like to do something on climate if they thought they had the political, capital to do so. But right now, given the toxic state of the politics of that party, it's just not a possibility.
Right. There are no Bob Inglis's today who are willing to actually take a risk.
Right. Right. And even, Lindsey Graham was once on the right side of this when, along with, his friend John McCain, and then unfortunately betrayed sort of everything that he had once supported there. Question here.
I have a question for both of you to answer in your own way or together. I'm wondering what would drive the tipping point, or I'll call it get to the jugular of the fossil fuel industry? I mean, how do we, what are the things that
Got a
get
final
there
chapter on
most directly?
Well, I'm happy to provide some thoughts, and I'm sure Congressman has some as well. Yeah, what would the tipping point where we see the collapse of the fossil fuel industry? Where does that happen? I think that happens pretty quickly. I think that we do reach a critical juncture through a combination of, again, the carrot and the stick. I think the IRA is going to go some ways towards doing that. I mean, it is going to reduce fossil fuel, emissions by roughly 40% by 2030. And it doesn't stop at 2030. We continue that trajectory. By mid-century, we're looking at pretty close to zero carbon emissions. So that transition is going to happen. There is, an old saying, the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones. And the fossil fuel age won't end for want of fossil fuels. We used to, here off the coast of California, we used to whale for whale oil, to burn whale oil, as a source of energy. Something better came along. That was fossil fuels. And now something better than that has come along. That's renewable energy. And so that transition is happening. It's not happening fast enough. We need to accelerate that transition, and so that's what we're really talking about.
That's exactly right. That's the tipping point. It's renewable energy.
Question right back here.
I used to work in the House when there was 40 or 50 Republicans that signed on. I worked for one of the congressmen that authored the 1990 Clean Air Act. And my question, probably more for Congressman Huffman, whether or not within, we're all relatively progressive, or very progressive here. Within our community, is there actually the support for the carbon tax, which is a market incentive? Because when I was working and amending the 1990 Clean Air Act, I used to work for the Sierra Club, and when I worked as Congressman, I had my environmentalist friends accusing me of being a traitor because they said, Graham, all you're doing is creating a permit to pollute by creating the tradable permits of the 1990 Clean Air Act. And so are progressives
You're going to want to speak to this too, though.
actually on board with the carbon tax? Because I really hope they are.
Yeah, the question is, are progressives actually on board? Does this thing have political viability? Dr. Mann takes this on very specifically in the book. And from my perspective, it is all about how you design it. It's not about whether a carbon price, whether it is a cap and trade or fee and dividend or a carbon tax, can be gamed. There's a reason that, Exxon and others have been factoring in carbon taxing, internally, and say that they'll support a carbon tax. There's all sorts of trapdoors in what they will support. They want all these quid pro quos, relief from liability, and tie the hands of the EPA on regulating if we get a carbon tax. And they want to do it in a way where it would be what the critics call it. Just basically a license to continue business as usual, pay a little carbon penalty, but don't make any real change. We can design it, though, in a way that will be much more effective and progressive. Dr. Mann, though, does a great job breaking it down.
I can't say it any better myself. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Usual Suspects. There's a great line from that film, which I've adapted for this purpose. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was getting progressives to oppose carbon pricing. And Congressman Huffman is absolutely right. There are some pitfalls and trapdoors that have been set by the fossil fuel industry in the sort of carbon pricing that they have proposed. And it's interesting to see sort of the game of telephone that's evolved from that, where one of the talking points among some progressives who are opposed to carbon pricing is, well, carbon pricing means that we will shield the fossil fuel industry from liability. No, it only means that if we accepted their ridiculous straw man of a carbon pricing scheme. And we see, we see actually, this tactic of division, because one of the things that the fossil fuel industry has tried to do is to take sort of climate progressives and to divide us along those sort of natural fault lines, race and religion, individual behavior. What's more personal to you than your individual lifestyle choices? So if you can get vegetarians fighting with people who eat meat and shaming them, and it devolves into this argument between people who support climate action. And so one of the things that we've seen, and actually I think it was Chevron. I think it was Chevron that, again, another one of these campaigns that, these insidious campaigns that was outed by one NGO, where Chevron had been sponsoring advertising to convince essentially the minority communities that carbon pricing would hurt them, that it would mean, that the refineries, they're going to be the ones subject to the ongoing emissions and the pollution that comes from that. And so there's been this effort to divide climate progressives, to convince climate progressives that carbon pricing, for example, is somehow incompatible with issues of equality and justice, particularly this idea that a carbon price will hurt low-income earners, when in fact, if you look at where carbon pricing has been successfully implemented in Canada, in Australia, it's actually ended up being progressive, because the carbon pricing schemes have preferentially returned revenue. It all depends on what you do with the revenue. And if that revenue is returned progressively to low-income and frontline communities, then it's not regressive, then it's progressive. The other argument you hear is that, well, no carbon price is going to be high enough to get us the carbon emissions reductions that we need. And I agree with that, which is why nobody is saying that carbon pricing is the only thing we do.
Yeah, amen to all of that. Dr. Mann, can I ask you a question? Please. Because as I was reading your book, I wanted to ask you questions that kind of take it onto the global stage and really the foreign policy stage about Russia and China. So one of the things that jumped out at me is the extent to which you seem to believe that a lot of the disinformation and meddling and interference we've seen from Russia, certainly in our last two national elections, but also in Brexit and in other cases, was, maybe there's a narrative out there, it's about destabilizing the West or sowing division and disunity. I've heard that from our intelligence briefings back on the Hill. But you posit, and I tend to agree, that it's all about fossil fuel. And so I wonder if you could maybe speak to that a little bit. And then the other kind of denialist playbook strategy that I've encountered that you didn't write about in the book, but I wanted to ask you about, is this narrative that because this is a global problem, we can't get out ahead of China, who is now the world's largest pollution. Until we bring China online, we just can't do anything here in the U.S. It would be our competitive disadvantage. So a couple of global questions.
Thanks. Yeah, and I maybe touch on that at the edges, but not as directly as you framed it there. China, this is a favorite talking point of conservative opponents to climate action. Well, what about China? It's whataboutism, right? Whataboutism. What about China? Well, what about China is what I say. When we had a bilateral agreement under Barack Obama with China to lower carbon emissions. We were lowering our carbon emissions, by I think it was going to be 25% relative to 2005, and they had to peak their emissions by 2030 because we are, a mature industrial country. They are still industrializing country, so the sort of expectations are a little bit different. But they, were required to peak their carbon emissions, and they ended up not only reducing their coal burning by the amount that they had committed to, but they exceeded their commitments. They were decommissioning coal-fired power plants in China, and they were massively scaling up renewable energy, solar panels, of course, flooding the global market with cheap solar panels. We should be so, yeah, that's the sort of problem you like to have. And then what happened? We elected Donald Trump, and the first thing out of his mouth, actually, the first thing was this phone call with Malcolm Turnbull of Australia, which I'm doing an event with Malcolm in a couple weeks in Philadelphia. He was the former Prime Minister of Australia, a conservative, by the way, who was committed to climate action, sort of like the old school New England and moderate Republicans who supported, climate action. Actually, William K. Riley, former EPA administrator, lives not too far away from here. Yeah. There was a time when, and so Malcolm Turnbull is sort of that sort of politician out of Australia. Well, he the same reward, I suppose, that Republicans who have supported climate action or impeachment for that matter. What is it? 8 of 10 of them out of 14. 10 out of
12 are gone.
12 are gone. 12 out of 14 are gone. Well, if you've had a few drinks with Malcolm Turnbull, and he may just do his impression of Donald Trump from that phone call, where he proceeded to insult one of our most important, international allies. In any case, the point being, China was actually going beyond their commitments, but then we suddenly communicated to the world that we were no longer serious about keeping our commitments. And if we're not serious, then why should China be serious about that? And that's when we saw China begin to build more coal-fired power plants. The good news is that we have re-engaged with the global community. That's one of the most important things, in my view, that the Biden administration has done. John Kerry, who helped negotiate the Paris Agreement, for example. We have now seen that re-engagement, and we have seen China, they're not yet doing as much as we'd like to see them do, but there is a lot of progress there. So I think the message there is that when the United States, the world's largest cumulative carbon emitter, let's never forget that. They love to talk about how much carbon China is producing right now. Let's talk about how much carbon we've added to the atmosphere. It's far more than any other country. And so that means that if we are not meeting our obligations, how can we expect China and India and others who would love to grow their economies off of cheap, dirty energy if there isn't a better alternative, if we don't provide them the incentives to use clean energy? That's why that's so important, that, and that was one of the first things, actually, that the Trump administration got rid of in the IPCC, in the UN commitments of the United States, was the money that was intended to help countries like India, move in the direction of renewable energy. Your other question was...
Russia, is it really all about fossil fuel?
So I'd like to take credit for sort of laying that out, but actually Rachel Maddow in her book does a remarkably good job of really laying out that case. I'm not going to belabor the point because, there are a few more questions we'd like to get to. A $500 billion oil deal between ExxonMobil and Rosneft. That was not possible because of the sanctions against Russia under the Obama administration, which Hillary Clinton was going to keep. what was one of the first things they negotiated, that Paul Manafort negotiated out of the Republican platform, were the sanctions against Russia. And who did Donald Trump appoint as his Secretary of State? Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. I posit that this is not a coincidence.
In the last couple of weeks, in 5 weeks, we've seen 5,000-year storms in the U.S. I was in the Antarctic when it was 70 degrees above normal temperatures. And what I'm seeing is a lot of people coming out and saying everything's accelerating faster than expected. Is that the right-wing doomsayers going, oh, shit, it's too late, too hard? Or is that actually true with the models? Are things actually accelerating faster than we thought?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question, because it's really important to distinguish between.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, you know, we hear about, you know, it's 70 degrees warmer than normal in Antarctica. It's all of these events, these 5,000 year events that are happening every day. Is this sort of seems to confirm this narrative that climate change is exceeding the predictions, what climate scientists have predicted. And, you know, is that true? And does it play into doomism? I always like to distinguish between being alarmed and being alarmist. We should be alarmed. We shouldn't be alarmist, which is to say we shouldn't overstate the impacts of climate change, because the truth is bad enough. This is, my old friend Steve Schneider, who was a leading climate scientist and climate communicator at Stanford University for many years, used to say that the truth is bad enough. The truth is reason enough for us to take dramatic action. And so if you look at what the models predicted, you know, a lot of this we predicted. In fact, ExxonMobil, I talk about this in the book, in 1982, there's an internal document from ExxonMobil's own scientists where they refer to potentially catastrophic consequences. And by the way, their scientists back in 1982 predicted where CO2 would be right now and how much the planet would warm, with a back of the napkin calculation that was pretty much spot on. What was so remarkable, that their ability to predict that we would be at the CO2 level that we're at, means they were able to predict that their company and other fossil fuel industries' disinformation campaign would be successful in preventing us from taking action to curtail fossil fuel burning. So ExxonMobil predicted much of what we're seeing right now. The warming that we've seen of the planet is almost exactly what the climate models predicted it would be. Some of the impacts are exceeding what we would expect given that amount of warming. And some of my own research has to do with some of the subtle ways that climate change is impacting the jet stream. So we get more of those resilient ridge events, for example, on the West Coast, where you see the drought and the heat and the wildfires. The climate models don't do a good job in capturing how, the increase in the frequency and persistence of those sorts of events. And there's some good reasons for that. The physics of it is detailed enough, and the models are run at a low enough resolution that they're not quite capturing all of the physical processes that are necessary there. That's something to be concerned about. Another thing to be concerned about is ice sheet dynamics, because as go the ice sheets, the Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, and some of you may have read there was just a study the other day, that we're probably now guaranteed at least a foot of sea level rise from Greenland alone, and I think that's probably right. At every juncture, as we've revised the models, as we've made the ice sheet models more realistic, so they contain more of the physics that describes how ice sheets work, we have found that ice sheets are more dynamic than the models sort of depicted them as being, that they can lose ice faster, that there are processes like cracks that form that allow meltwater to penetrate to the bottom of the ice sheet, which lubricates it so it can slide off into the ocean, or buttressing effects, you lose the ice shelves. Those ice shelves are buttresses that hold up the inland ice, and so that inland ice can now start to surge out to the ocean. Some of the physics of that isn't well captured in the earlier generation ice sheet models. And so when it comes to ice sheet collapse, and with that sea level rise and extreme weather events, we are seeing the impacts exceeding what models predicted, say, even 5 or 10 years ago. The truth is bad enough. Yeah.
Now, you were talking about global, talking about China and Russia, but you know, when I look at Pakistan now, in terms of the 1,000 people died, and the Bangladesh, which is below sea level, is there something globally that America can, you know, that we can do to kind of have an impact, you know, internationally? Because the ice water melting is going to affect us all. And it affects us as far as Miami. So, you know, we're losing so much, not both domestically and internationally. Is there kind of beyond the Paris, is there anything else we need to do globally?
I'm going to pass this one to the Congressman.
You know, I think it's the same answer. I think it is this war against the fossil fuel industry, and it just underscores that we're running out of time, that we're starting to see 30% of an entire country underwater in an extreme flood event, among all of these other terrible wake-up calls. So, look, I think the United States has a chance with the industrial policy reforms we've set in motion, with this new legislation and some of the things that the Biden administration is doing on its own, some of the things that industry and the private sector is undertaking to dramatically decarbonize in a way that gives us a great jumpstart toward making that happen. These clean cars are going to be super important. And to me, when we talk about things that we can do in our community here in California, in our regular lives, understanding individual action is not the silver bullet, but we want to do it anyway. Electric cars, I think, are the most important because we're contributing to a real transformation, a game changer that will, you know, stick a dagger in the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, and I want to reinforce that. It's such an important point. Our individual actions can put pressure on industry, so it's all part of the solution. Yeah. Okay. One more question here.
I have a comments and questions. So I just want to thank you both for your leadership on this issue. I've worked on it myself for over 20 years as a climate communicator for President Obama at the EPA, among other roles. And I'm biased by the work that I've done, but I really feel that we don't know how to talk about it. We still don't know. We don't know how to talk about it across the aisle in Washington. That was very clear to me when I worked there. And we don't know how to talk about it among each other around the Thanksgiving table. We just don't have the language. We don't have the scope. It's a very complicated issue. So I just want to encourage everybody to really learn how to engage other people on it, because I think ultimately that's what will get us there, right? We're butting heads, and it's not helpful. It's my comment for what it's worth. And my question is, where should we all move to?
Well, you know, there's a reason that all the billionaires are very interested right now in going to other planets. It seems to me, you know, because they figure out they're screwing up ours. And actually, if you've seen Don't Look Up, there is a biting commentary about that. And it's a really interesting commentary on techno solutions and the danger in relying on tech that'll supposedly magically solve the problem for us. You know, I'm not yet ready for us to abandon our positions in the climate wars, I suppose, to use that analogy. You know, we can maintain a livable planet, and most of us reside in places that will remain viable, you know, locations for us to live if we take the actions that are necessary. If we don't, then yeah, we are talking about dystopian futures. You know, the sort of post-apocalyptic depictions, you know, that Hollywood has provided us. That is a worst-case scenario. We will live on a planet where large parts are too hot and too dry, and where there's greater conflict because there are more people and fewer resources, water, space, and we're seeing that already. We've seen, just instability in the Middle East. The Syrian uprising was a consequence of an epic drought, an unprecedented drought. So, yeah, we're starting to see tears at the seams. And if, there's a reason we talk a lot about the need to keep warming below 1.5 Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the next decade, because those are the sorts of actions that will probably keep us within our adaptive capacity. Warm much beyond that, and we can no longer guarantee that. So I'm not yet ready to say, it's time to move up to create cities in the Arctic, and that's a possible future, but it doesn't have to be our future at this point.
Thank you, and I'm going to close by thanking Dr. Mann, but let me just say that to your question, one of the interesting ways of thinking that Dr. Mann shares in his book is the combination of both urgency and agency, in his words. And so that agency, but we still have a lot of control over just how screwed we are in this climate crisis. And the book, I think, goes into great detail about that. So I just want to end by thanking Dr. Mann for coming to Marin. And want to thank him also for dedicating his life and his career and his incredible talents to the most important possible thing he could dedicate them to, and being a leader, working with members of Congress and people all over the planet to try to get this right. He is just a hero in every way. And I hope all of you will buy and read his book. It's really good.